Yeah, sure.
Good to go.
All right, we can see your screen. Presentation mode. All right. All right, you're good to go, Larry. All right. Hi. Yeah. So this presentation is going to go into some incident response activity we've been doing, and a little bit about a platform we've been using that has been quite useful. So I'm going to go into a little bit about how to do incident response on this platform. Do some demos. Actually, I'm going to do a demo about how to find Log4j vulnerabilities, and also how to do like real-time monitoring of DNS and do things like that. So get started. All right. Okay. So here it is. So basically, the basis of this presentation is there's this incident response platform called Velociraptor, and as I said before, we've been using it fairly successfully in certain engagements. Also, we're thinking about using it internally, and it's based on a systems query language, and it lets you do forensics and analysis. Runs on Linux and Windows. Pretty stable. Been running it now for at least a year. Fairly stable. I haven't noticed many problems. Basically, you can search for different types of objects across many systems efficiently, memory and data objects, files, pretty much you name it. Also ties in with event subsystems of, especially with Windows, such as ETW, and we'll go into ETW, but ETW is pretty much the new de facto standard way of interacting with events internal to Windows. In fact, the whole entire Windows logging subsystem is based on ETW. Velociraptor actually has a module that talks directly to ETW, so you can get quite a bit of detailed information. And then so basically you use this VQL language, which is built into the agent that runs on the system, and then you basically can create customized queries. And then basically run them on the endpoints, and then we'll go into what that looks like. So the Velociraptor, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into a little bit about what the console looks like and how you use it, and then we'll go into some live stuff in action. So this is basically it's a real-time system. So once the agent is very compact, it's barely noticeable. It's less than a fraction of a % resource utilization. It's pretty much just tiny little program, a couple $100K. It has a secure certificate-based PKI authentication to the back end. When it's real-time, dual WebSockets, bidirectional WebSockets. So there's a keeper light heartbeat. So when it's green, it means your endpoint's alive and you can interact with it. So just my lab network here. So I got a couple of servers and a desktop. And then actually this is what an artifact looks like. And then basically there's a description of what it does, and then there's a VQL. It's like a SQL-like language, and this tells you what it's going to do. This particular artifact is basically, the artifact is what you execute on the endpoint. This particular artifact is collecting some forensics information from the endpoint, evidence of execution, basically whatever's recently been executed on the system. As you can see here, it's going to look into the registry, some time-based breakdown of the events, what apps were executed, anything in the app cache, anything in the prefetch. So this is there's a set of, this is just one particular artifact, and this is very forensics focused. And as you can see, this is a list of some other ones that are possible. I guess, yeah, it runs on the Mac and as an endpoint as well. So it's got pretty good coverage. Yeah, so Firefox history, all kinds of stuff, Chrome cookies. So you could pull this off at any endpoint. A hunt is basically a way to run an artifact quickly across a bunch of systems. You can actually, when you configure an endpoint, when you deploy it to an endpoint, you can also label that endpoint. So you can run hunts on labels, or you can run it on everywhere, or just run it on specific operating systems. We're actually going to do a hunt for a Log4j. So you'll get to see that in action. And then one thing that's really nice is this thing called the Artifact Exchange, where like you got a whole community out there building these detections, and then you can these very easily can be deployed into your Velociraptor system. Yeah, we'll go into that as well. Okay, so let's do that sample hunt. Just to show you, get this thing out of the way. Yeah, so this is actually the this particular URL here is actually the oops. Yeah, this is the exchange, right? This is an artifact I was looking at. So let's take a look here. All right, so this is the Artifact Exchange live. Like you can say, okay, I want to look for Log4j detections. We'll look at those, and then here's a whole bunch of Log4j detections. You can just go ahead. It gives you an example of what this thing does, and then you can go into it, and then you can just read about it. And then the actual artifact itself is this orange and green, which it's very easy to deploy. If we go to this is the actual live Velociraptor console. You can see these are the three objects we saw before. This is where the artifacts are. You can easily just add the artifact. If you go look at one of these artifacts, this is one that was already in here, but you can just add a new one. And to add it, you just literally, all you do is you go in here, you cut and paste this, and you cut and paste it, oops, right into here, and then boom, you're in business. You can go ahead and you can run it. So that's, or you could write your own from scratch, or you can modify one. It's pretty nice actually. All right, so yeah, so these are the artifacts, and as you can see, there's a whole bunch of stuff available already. And then we're going to actually do a quick hunt here. Let's see here. Let's see. Oh, the heck. Right, for some reason I'm not seeing everything. All right. Anyway, that's weird. Okay, so all right, so let's go ahead and go. Okay, so I had one that I just ran before, but we're gonna do a new one. There's the hunt. We're gonna do a Log4j. Okay, we're gonna run it everywhere. We're gonna select an artifact. I'm gonna do let's see here. Okay, so we're gonna do this Log4j. Actually, let's run this one. I haven't run this one before. Okay, select artifacts. If there's any parameters you need to configure, you can configure them here. Special. This is the resourcing. So another nice thing is you can adjust it. It's resource limits. So basically, if you only want it to run for a certain amount of time, or use a certain amount of CPU, or upload a max amount of data, so you can actually, if you're running a large amount of these, to save resources, you can limit the resources. This is the artifact it's going to run, and you click on launch. It goes into this pause state, and then you basically just execute it. you click on it. This is, and then you execute it. For right now, this is going to run, be scheduled to run on all the live endpoints, because I didn't customize it for any subgroups. So when we run it, and then we just wait. So as you, so that's that. This is when I ran the other time, and then you can go to basically this basically tells you what it was run on. It's finished, and then if there's any data that comes back, it'll be come back as a row. So as you can see, one row came back, which means this vulnerability was found on one endpoint. See here. So we go to the hunt. All right. So, okay, so it's still running on the third one, but as you can see, I've run it on 3 endpoints here. And then looks like it found something on one of the endpoints. Let's see here. And this is an actual full search of the entire, yeah, there's nothing on the other one, so it should come back. Nothing. Eventually. It's probably a slower system. Okay, it doesn't matter. I don't think there's anything on it anyway. But anyway, so yeah, so let's go take a look at this flow ID. Okay, so basically, this is the collection. So if we go close this, so this is the endpoint that it was collected on, and this is the flow, is the actual run of the collection itself. And as you can see, the results here, it found a jar file in this particular directory that's has the Apache vulnerability on it. And then see, you can actually, I don't have it configured right now, but then you can actually create one of these artifact, an artifact that just deletes that file. You can actually have that run, that thing run across all the machines you want. You can actually, you can actually remediate with the system, because it can read and write to the file system. And then you can also, if you want, since it found this, go here directly, and you can look at the collections itself. And this is actually the endpoint itself now that we're on now. And then yeah, we can take a look at the results, and you can see here it is. You can, this is the actual vulnerable endpoint. And you can actually go to the endpoint. I think I have it here. All right, so it's on, I think it's on this endpoint here. This one. This is DCO2, I think. Let's see. We'll just go here. This DC. So just look, is this the right endpoint? Okay, yeah, this is the right endpoint. Okay, so this, as you can see, if we just look at that Velociraptor here, you just go to see users downloads. Okay, we'll go there. See. Downloads. And there it is. There's the vulnerable directory with the vulnerable log4j file in it. So yeah, so it's that easy to, if you have it running on your endpoint, you can just quickly run something like this on all your endpoints, and then find exactly which endpoints are vulnerable, which directories, and this finds like all the vulnerable files, regardless of where it is. So it's very comprehensive, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, so we'll go back to the presentation. Okay, so that was that, and so we take a look at this, and let's go back. All right. So that's static, static query, but you can also do more dynamic things as well, called event queries. Basically, what happens is you run a query, and it continuously runs the query on the endpoint and returns the data back to you. And you can run it, periodically. You can run it. You can set a timer. You can run it every few seconds. You can run it every 10 minutes. And then this is actually good for stuff like, if you need to go and see if the client's communicating back somewhere to some kind of C2 server, some type of a malicious back end, or you want to take a look at some of its DNS queries or stuff like that, you can actually run this thing and to collect a query to collect real-time data. And the problem with the traditional way of doing things is what happens is the endpoint or the EDR is collecting data. Then that data has to go into a log. That data has to go to a SIM, and then some SIM operator has to run a search. And then by the time, you may not get all the data you want, and then you got to go back again, and you got to adjust the search, and then you got to go back in this loop again. So this is the traditional way of doing things. You're getting a set of data. You're getting this to the SIM. You're doing some SIM searches. Maybe you might have some SIM alerts. You kind of have to look at it, and then you go back and forth to this kind of a loop. But you can't really do any real-time analysis with the SIM. Not to say the SIM is bad. It's got some important usage, but for real-time DFI events like ransomware attacks and other types of things like that, it's a little bit harder to give you the agility. It's harder. It doesn't give you the agility. So in this case, we get basically quickly, we can see quickly what's going on, and then you can actually adjust the query real time on the endpoint using the artifact. And you've basically got a direct connection to the event as it occurs in real time, and then you can actually respond to that event in real time by creating VQL or adjusting some other VQL. So what would be a good way to look at this? So let's say or a good way to use this type of thing. Let's say you want to detect when a log is disabled. So how would you go about detecting when a log is disabled? And then you can actually run this query. The Velociraptor agent can handle multiple types of VQL. You could just attach it to the VQL agent, and it'll run it periodically. We can even run that once every, this type of query once every 15 minutes, hour, a couple hours to detect when the log has been actively disabled. So you can actively check for these changes. What would that look like? Oops. Okay, yeah. So that's creating artifact. We already covered that. That's not important. So yeah, so Velociraptor's got this plugin called the Diff plugin, and this will actually can be run periodically to detect changes in output. So what it will do is it's monitoring a certain registry key. This is the actual key in here. This is actually the VQL in this particular artifact, and this is actually looking at the registry key that enables or disables the Windows event logs. And so this is going to basically tell you exactly when this particular log has been disabled, and then you can actually you can set up and it'll actually alert you. Another thing that's really good is it can launch and manage Sysmon. So basically, Sysmon is a basically like a real-time analysis tool that sits on an endpoint that looks at very low-level events, like when device drivers are loaded. You can detect a lot of ransomware type activity with it. When process injection occurs, all kinds of stuff like that. Velociraptor lets you manage the Sysmon install across all the systems. You can actually just here's the artifact for that. You just run it against all the systems. You can also the Sysmon config file can be deployed as you could see here. You could set in the config the Sysmon binary and the Sysmon config. You can also set up you can configure the event logs forwarding. Let's say you wanted to forward the Sysmon log somewhere, like let's say to Splunk. You can run an artifact to do that. You can forward all the Sysmon data collection to Splunk as well. So just something else that's I think useful. And then yeah, this thing's kind of in the way here. All right. Okay, so basically, yeah, so that's a little bit about how real-time events work in its basic form. Another thing that we can integrate with pretty well is event tracing for Windows. And this is the underlying system by which event logs are generated and collected. This actually, like I mentioned earlier before, is the source of events for the current Windows event log. So the Windows event log is actually an ETW event consumer. So all those logs, security logs, all the system logs for debugging that you use in Windows, it all comes from the ETW subsystem. Velociraptor is actually an ETW event consumer, which you can custom configure. So if you need to do low-level monitoring, this is actually available. And then if we take a quick peek, let me just go for it for a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So basically, when you go to an endpoint, you can actually query what event providers are available on a system. So we can actually go do that. Let's see on one of these Windows servers here that we were looking at. Sure if it's Logman will run in PowerShell, but we'll soon find out. So okay, so that was Logman query providers. So we do a Logman. So if you want to see what in a Windows system, what type of log providers there are, you can run that utility. It tells you exactly which ones. The most important thing is this GUID, which is the ID of this log provider. But as you can see, you got this is all low-level system events that you can get from a Windows system, and there's I think there's like 100 or so of them at least. So all this detail here. But we'll go back, and so that's the event provider there, and you can see where we got that, and then this is one particular provider we're going to take a quick peek at. This is called the Microsoft Windows DNS Client, and that's its GUID right there. And this lets you basically monitor DNS traffic on an endpoint using ETW. So let's say you've got a couple of systems that you want to you're thinking that may have some malware on it. You want to see if it's connecting out to some weird place, or what traffic, or some weird traffic might be going on that thing, and you want to isolate it. You can quickly take a look at the DNS queries using this ETW with the Velociraptor event consumer. We'll take a quick peek at that. Okay, where's the ETW event consumer here? Oh yeah, we'll have to go to the Velociraptor console for this. Okay, all right. So we'll go back to home. These are our clients. Yeah, so if we go to the artifact and we go to ETW, which I'll show you quickly a little bit about what's available there. So you can see all these are just some of the ETW. WMI process, view sessions. Yeah, so that's some of the stuff you can see, because the DNS queries on the server side. This is the client. This is basically it for the VQL for the DNS ETW query. That's if you saw that list, search I did, that was the GUID for that particular event. And basically, all you really need to do is I think I have that. Yeah, so all you basically need to do is those are the ETW, perfect, is select which data elements to build what is ETW queries. You select which data elements you want, and then you just do from watch ETW, and then that GUID that you get, and you can get that GUID from that list, and then you can also get these data elements. There's actually a website called etwproviders.docs, and then in here you can it's basically a GitHub, and it has every single one of those ETWs, and it has a list of the XML, the manifests of each version of Windows, and basically yeah. So these are the different providers in that list, the event providers, and as like the IE one. Oops. Right, so you can look at the XML, and these are the data elements. So if you want any of these data elements, you can grab which ones you want, and then you can build it. And here you can select you put the event data query name, what you want, and here the list, and then you can get the custom. You can create the custom VQL for that particular ETW query. Okay, all right, so let's move on here. Okay, so yeah, so this is the server, ETW server query provider. Like, as I said, Velociraptor has a few ETW artifacts built in from popular ones, but you can always create your own. You can just leverage, you can just cut and paste this particular artifact and create a new one, or edit it, customize it, basically however you want. And you can create a new artifact, and then you can execute those as well. This is the DNS client that we just looked at. These are basically this is basically what this is basically what it's going to collect from the endpoint. This is actually a little bit customized from the one in Velociraptor, but yeah. So these are all in the XML I showed you. These are all the events. These are all the data elements in the ETW provider. Select which ones you want from that XML list. You plug in this GUID, and then yeah, then you've got a brand new ETW provider. As long as you use that watch ETW command, and then yeah. So and then we were talking about what's the difference between a client and a client event artifact, right? So the client artifact was what we did first with the Log4J. So that was Log4J, and then that's just basically you just send a VQL query down to the client for a particular collection, and then like let's say I want to find all the vulnerable log4j jars or whatever binaries they are, or I want to see if there's any data files related to this particular vulnerability or exploit. I want to see if there's any evidence IOC related to that. It also supports YARA rules. I don't know if people are familiar with YARA rules, but some of the artifacts you can actually plug in the YARA rules. It'll search the whole entire endpoint with those YARA rules. So you're doing certain types of threat hunting. So that's kind of like more of a static one. And then the client event artifact will run continuously, and they stream back data as the events occur. And that's more of like what we're looking at now with ETW. That's like the DNS stuff. So let's take a quick peek at that. Okay, so let's see here. So here, select artifacts. Okay, so I have the DNS endpoint running on one of the clients, which is actually the Windows client. As you can see, this thing's collecting data from the endpoint, and then you can actually, I think you could slide. You can see, you can just look by time. You can just go ahead and see what's happening at what time. So you can actually in real time. This is like the timeline. It tells you exactly when, at what time. There's a timestamp, and then you can scroll through this timeline. And you can actually, these are actually actual DNS queries from that particular endpoint that are happening in real time. And this continuously happens at the collection interval you set until permanently. So it never stops until you shut it down. So you can set up some very sophisticated real-time analysis of events on endpoints using this methodology. And yeah, so we actually have found vulnerable Log4j systems that other people weren't able to find. Lots of interesting things using this as an incident response tool. Okay, so that's that. Yeah, this was that. Let's go back here to the presentation. Okay, all right. So that's the difference between the client and the client event artifact. The client is more static. It's more for hunting for certain static objects. Client event artifacts are for running continuously on the client. And you'll notice in the artifact itself, in the top, it's going to tell you whether it's a client artifact or client event artifact. So you'll be able to know what type of deployment you need. And then the event artifacts are deployed into this watcher section. And then you deploy them similar to hunts, like by labeled endpoints or OS. Very similarly, you can deploy them. Let's see. Let's continue. All right, so what's that? Okay, so yeah, so that was the example I showed you. All right, so to round things out here, we'll do another little thing. So this another thing you can detect with Velociraptor is parent process ID spoofing. Parent process ID spoofing is a technique that allows attackers to start programs with arbitrary parent process set. This is a common way attackers and malware uses to fool EDRs. They because what EDRs often look to make sure that there's no, if let's say Notepad springs another process that is like doing some system scan or something like this, or some other odd thing, like shouldn't be apparent to another process, right? Certain programs shouldn't be apparent to another process. So what parent process ID spoofing is, you change that so that it looks normal. Yeah, so it doesn't look odd that the process was spoofed. So basically, you could, there's a particular provider called Microsoft Windows kernel process, and then you can configure a client event artifact with that, and then here's an example, particular VQL for that, and then you basically you want to you want to see if I think it's so basically this is the VQL for parent process ID spoofing. You just would take this VQL, you would create you put it into an artifact, and then you could run it on the endpoints, and then what will happen is this will generate some rows events, and then it'll detect, it'll create a process event. So in the legitimate example, you'll see that in the rows that are returned that the event header process ID and parent process ID correctly match. And then this will be a row in the result of the detection for coming back. And then as you saw in the DNS example, you can just run this something if you suspect that there's some weird activity on any endpoints, you can run this, and then you can it'll periodically come back and it'll do an analysis and to see if the event header process ID and parent process ID are different. And then and if they are different, then you know that something's amiss, and then there's parent PID spoofing going on. So that's just another example of how this can be used, and there are actually many others. And then that's kind of my overview. So just for a quick conclusion, this is Velociraptor with the VQL is a powerful incident response platform. Can help with system, remediation of system-wide vulnerabilities like Log4j. As you can see, we did a demo of that, and then we can also do real-time event monitoring. In addition to, managing other types of security monitoring tooling, also forwarding data information to SIMs like Splunk without having to put a different agent on the endpoint, and much more. So so that's my presentation, and then take any questions.
Yeah, so thank you for your presentation, Larry. I haven't received any questions yet, but if I do, I will forward those to you, and we can respond accordingly. So our next talk is about SSLs